who's based at the Geography Department at the University of Oxford. Professor Jeffrey's work, if some of you might know, where he's been working on youth and politics, and especially in Uttar Pradesh, and wrote a rather influential piece called Time Pass, which was about the ideas of leisure and politics amongst a certain section of the youth in Uttar Pradesh, and what we might understand from it in terms of politics in general. And again, I think today we're not going to hear about youth politics in Uttar Pradesh, but we've moved uphill, as they would say in India. So we're going to talk about youth politics in Uttarakhand. And I'm not sure this is part of your new project on Jugaad, but Craig tells me he's just recently been awarded a British Academy Mid-Career Award to work on the concept of Jugaad, which is also another colloquialism like Time Pass, which is about inventiveness or techniques of innovation. And he's now interested in promoting public understanding of change and social change in India. So today we're going to talk much more about Uttarakhand, about positive youth politics, and we know why positive is a prefix now in this talk. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to the King's India Institute. I feel a little bit guilty that you might be in this room under false pretenses. I think my original title for this talk had the word Viagra.
Yes, yeah.
So if you're expecting to hear about Viagra, you better leave the room now. I'm not actually going to talk very much. I will just mention herbal Viagra in Uttarakhand about midway through the talk, but I'm talking more about politics. I didn't think it was very apt. I've got a view here, you probably can't see it. There's a yacht outside, and it's called Collective Spirit. And part of the theme for what I'm going to talk about today is the importance of thinking about collective spirit in the context of everyday politics. I should say the paper I'm giving today is a joint paper with Dr. Jane Dyson. I should also say it comes out of a larger research project that I'm leading that involves a team of 6 researchers doing work on the politics of educated unemployed youth in Sri Lanka, North India and Nepal. And we're right at the beginning of this project, which is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and runs until 2016. This is actually the first public presentation I've given on the fieldwork for the North India portion of this project, which is, as Kriti just said, in Uttarakhand. So I want to start with a little vignette, and it comes from an incident when I was walking back through the village of Bemni in March this year. I saw a friend of mine, Rampal, running very, very fast through the village. He was wearing, I can remember distinctly, checked green shirt, brown trousers. He was tearing along the muddy path. I thought he was going to fall over. I shouted to him, Rampal, where are you going? He said, I'm going to get her. I said, well, what do you mean? Who's her? She's run away. The shopkeeper's wife has run away because she's found out the shopkeeper's been having an affair with another woman in the village. I said, right, well, what are you going to do about it? Well, I'm going to get her, he said. She's actually run back to her natal village along the road, and I'm going to chase her down and try and persuade her to come back to the village to her husband. And off he went in the direction of the main road, direction beyond into the jungle. And interestingly, Rampal actually did set out to do what he planned to do. He met the shopkeeper's wife, he negotiated with her, and she came back to the village. Ultimately, at least when we left the village in June, from what I hear since that time, it seems to have worked out all right. The shopkeeper's wife is still in the village. And from a wider perspective, Rampal's dash quite literally helped us to shore up the village as a kind of social unit and to a certain extent protect the reputation of the village. I start with this example because it gets to the heart of one thing that I want to place absolutely centrally today, which is the everyday practices of young people like Rampal in Bemni village, and particularly their capacity to generate and maintain certain kinds of resources. The paper, though, is also a critical commentary on some of the recent writing on civil society in the global south and within India, and it's an attempt to outline a theory of what I'm calling generative politics, and I'm very interested to get your feedback on this new theory of generative politics, as we might grandly put it. So a highly influential debate emerging within post-colonial studies, particularly during the last 30 years, concerns the degree to which ordinary citizens in the global south, in Africa, Latin America and Asia, are generating everyday forms of civil society. A persuasive line of argument is that civil society is very thin in many parts of the global south. According to Jean-Francois Bayard, for example, people lack the organisational skills to congregate in formal associations in most parts of Africa. Instead, politics occurs mainly within predatory patron-client networks, a politics of the belly, in Bayard's terms. Memru Mamdani likewise argues that colonial powers in Africa deliberately work through the social categories of ethnicity and tribe, thus preventing the emergence of what he terms non-particularistic group life. As many people know, Sudipta Kaviraj and Partha Chatterjee have made some roughly similar arguments in work on India. Kaviraj maintains that the British strategy of divide and rule strengthened the social institution of caste. The post-colonial state developed in the absence of a broader sense of collective national citizenship. Chatterjee likewise argues that civil society, in its Hegelian sense of formal associations based on impartial notions of solidarity, is confined to a thin upper middle class in India. The majority instead occupy a zone of what he terms political society, in which they use caste, religious or other sectarian identities to bid on an ad hoc basis for resources from the state. Political society is like the politics of the belly, founded on relations of clientelism, and Chatterjee argues that it's usually paralegal or can be violent. Other scholars have argued that Bayard, Mamdani, Chatterjee and Kaviraj have underplayed the existence of civic understanding and action in places like Africa and South Asia. For example, my ex-supervisor, Stuart Corbridge, and colleagues have shown how the poor in Bihar and West Bengal have sometimes been able to connect with local levels of the state through deploying notions of citizenship and this sense of liberal democracy. Likewise, Nandini Sundar and Amita Bhaviska have argued that much of the political activity of the poor in India is not aggressively clientelistic. What, though, I want to ask of youth, what of young people, by which I mean people in their late teens and 20s, especially the large numbers of young people in poorer parts of the world who lack access to a good education, secure jobs, and reliable state support? An influential argument that some of you may have seen within the World Development Report last year, produced by the World Bank, is that marginalised, unemployed or underemployed youth are a major threat to civilised society and the state, and that they engage often in violent, illegal and clientelistic forms of politics. Such negative evaluations of youth rest, of course, on much older ideas of youth, and go at least as far as Stanley Hall's writing in 1904 about youth as a period of storm and stress. Pierre Bourdieu, as well as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, argued that youth are disengaged from politics altogether, or else are engaged only in a very idiosyncratic and ineffective forms of politics. Marx and Engels talk about unemployed youth as alchemists of the revolution, and they use the term ironically to suggest they're delusive forms of politics. So they're certainly not candidates, it would seem, for grassroots civil society. And within India, several scholars have identified unemployed youth or underemployed youth as being very important in terms of violent insurrection in urban areas. I think of the work of people like Thomas Hansen and Gerard Herzig. But from another perspective, we might imagine youth within and outside India as rather well positioned to move societies away from predatory clientelism and towards more democratic forms of activity. Karl Mannheim, a very nice essay, if you haven't seen it on the web, it's called The Problem of Generations. Mannheim argued very long ago, in the 1930s, that within any region, generations experience the same conditions at the same moment in their lives, and therefore come to constitute a kind of social unit. Now, in particular situations, this generation in itself can become a generation for itself. to paraphrase Marx. And Mannheim placed particular emphasis on the potential of youth. And I would argue that recent events put empirical flesh on the conceptual bones provided by Mannheim. We've seen large-scale democratic movements led by marginalised youth in Egypt, in Tunisia. We see it in anti-Putin demonstrations in Russia, and also examples at the moment in China and South America. But any argument about youth and democratic social movements runs into some problems in India. Because young people haven't actually led large-scale, visible social movements, democratic social movements in post-colonial India. And imagine there might be forests that has. No, you're wrong, Craig. Is that? I mean, the one exception that does immediately spring to mind is the Jai Prakash Narayan movement in the 1970s in Bihar. But there aren't many examples, and you could argue about whether the Hazara movement is an example of this, but there aren't many examples of widespread youth mobilisation in India. Young people's mobilisation in India seems to be happening at a more everyday level. For example, Anirudh Krishna has written of impoverished youth in Western India, who are very important intermediaries between the poor and the state. My own previous work in Western Uttar Pradesh has been a lot about a new generation of social reformers among Dalits, who in rural and urban areas act as self-styled new politicians, trying to circulate political critique and act as motivators in society. Now, politics in these studies, in my previous work and in Krishna's work, is less about large-scale mobilisation, about party political machinations or the grand affairs of state, and more about generating consensus and navigating conflict in pursuit of a definite end. And that's my working definition of politics in this presentation. So, generating consensus and navigating conflict in pursuit of a definite end. Generative politics, then, refers to efforts to build consensus and avoid conflict with a view to creating productive resources for the poor and lower middle class, where resources is defined very broadly to include information, social networks, and self-confidence, as well as resources as we might normally think of them: money, assets, and jobs. Our overall argument is that youth are engaged in generative politics in a village in Uttarakhand, North India, but this politics also shared some of the characteristics of clientelist politics discussed, for example, by Bayat and Chatterjee. So this isn't, I'm not setting up Bayat, Chatterjee and others as straw men, as it were. I'm rather trying to think with their ideas and enter into a conversation. Uttarakhand was established as a separate state of India roughly 12 years ago, carved out of the former state of Uttar Pradesh. It contained about 10 million people in 2011. Uttarakhand is a state notorious for its poverty, and economic reforms in India enacted since the mid-1980s served on the whole to widen the gap between it and more prosperous states, mainly in the south. Higher caste Hindus, also called general castes or GCs, are generally in a slightly better social position than Muslims and scheduled castes or SCs. Another important point to note about Uttarakhand, like many parts of North India, is that patriarchal norms mean that men often have control over family decision-making and monopolise paid employment, at least secure paid employment. Bentley village is located in a relatively remote part of Uttarakhand, and Jane asked me how to show a map, so I need to identify exactly where it is, but it's bordering Tibet in Chamoli district, where if you know this part of India. It's at an altitude of about 2,500 metres, so about 8,000 feet. You really feel it when you go up there, actually. It's high. And this is a picture of them looking down onto the Mandakini Valley, the central part of the village. You actually migrate between 3 separate settlements on the mountainside according to the season. And this is a picture from another angle which shows that the new road was constructed in Bentley very, very recently, just the last couple of years. People typically practice a form of agro-pastoralism. They cultivate crops for subsistence, while also managing large areas of the surrounding forest for pastoral use. Bentley contained 645 people in March this year, of which 69% were GCs and 31% SCs. Between March and June of this year, Generative conducted 3 months of research in Bentley, examining the economic, social and political practices of marginalised youth, young people like Grandpa, especially those who were educated but unemployed, or who define themselves as underemployed. And this was a follow-up to research that Jane did in 2003 and 2004. She spent 15 months in Bentley over those 2 years doing PhD research, and she was very interested there in children's work and children's identity. So in some cases we were able to follow children that Jane had met in 0304 who had now become youth in 2012. Bentley looked physically very different in 2012 to how it did in 2003. Less green, dustier, more, in a sense, developed. Particularly the road, also the new communications tower. You can just about see it there in very white. Government had built a lot of new buildings, and some people have constructed two-storied houses. There were also attitudinal changes. Between 03 and 2012, Bentley was more thoroughly absorbed into wider circuits of knowledge and information. People were keener on education, and they were also keener to move out of the village, especially the young. There's been a decline too in agriculture. The area being farmed in and around Bentley actually halved between 03 and 2012. A lot of that is because of land sale to the government, but also there's been a more general demoralisation around agriculture, which is connected to very poor prices, to land degradation, a fall in the water table, and a huge increase in freak weather events connected to climate change. People are fed up of sowing crops and find they're destroyed by an unseasonal hailstorm, for example. So in what follows, I'll talk for about half an hour. I want to tell the stories of 3 young people and use those stories to outline this larger argument I want to make about generative politics. I want to start with a young man named Rajesh Singh, a Rajput, a GC, and I should say all these stories are about GCs. I can talk about a little bit about SCs during questions, but we haven't done as much research with SCs yet. So Rajesh Singh was a GC. He was 30 in 2012. This is a picture of him here. I think he's actually not the best picture of him, but he's taken the picture actually. He works part-time in the local secondary school. This is quite interesting. He managed to get the government to give bicycles to the local secondary school, which is wonderful because everyone could learn to ride a bicycle. The problem is, apart from this flat area in front of the school, this is the only place you can ride a bicycle within about a 10-mile radius of the village. And I only lost some people in the school. But nevertheless, it's important in terms of learning a new skill. And at this particular event, I remember girls were cycling around, falling off very quickly, trying to learn how to cycle in this one flat area. Rajesh was educated in Bentley Primary School and then at the government secondary school near the village in the late 1990s. He received a BA Arts from Gopeshwar College, the government degree college in the district town, about a dozen miles from Bentley. He did the degree on a private or correspondence basis because his parents couldn't afford to enroll him as a regular student and support him in Gopeshwar. At the age of about 20, he went to Mumbai, where he worked for 6 months in a hotel. He later worked in Delhi fixing computers. But in 2003, Rajesh's father fell critically ill, and he had to return to the village. Rajesh managed the process of obtaining treatment for his dying father. After his father's death, Rajesh helped to secure a marriage for his sister. He also oversaw the construction of a new house for the family. And Rajesh is now married with 3 children. Rajesh went back to college after marriage. In 2012, he was conducting a Master's in English Literature from Garhwal University, again on a correspondence basis. Rajesh cannot get any of the original 40 texts that are on his syllabus. So he learned, he's bought 6 cheap books, he spends between 7 and 11 every evening memorising passages of these cheap books which will be produced in exams. So he's studying books like Judy Obscure by Thomas Hardy, plays like The Tempest by Shakespeare, without having seen any of the original sources, and without actually being able to speak more than a few words of English. Rajesh was employed on a temporary basis, as I said, in the secondary school. He also gave private tuitions to local young people. He cultivated the family's 3-acre farm. He particularly, this isn't Rajesh, it's a picture of people ploughing in the village to get a sense of farming situation. Men particularly were involved in ploughing. And he had a large vegetable garden close to his home. He spent about 40 days a year working on the government's employment guarantee scheme. He also occasionally went to collect forest products from the jungles and meadows above Bentley, which could be sold to local traders. Rajesh said these various forms of employment allowed him to get by, but he desperately hoped he might at the end get a government job. His chances of success seemed very remote, though. Rajesh was among 86,000 applicants for 79 low-ranking bureaucratic jobs advertised in March 2012 by the Uttarakhand state government. 86,000 applicants for 79 places. Alongside his everyday work and applications for government jobs, Rajesh spent a great deal of time engaged in social and political work. School textbooks, as you may know in India, are full of references to the importance of serving the nation. Quite right too. And a common exercise that I've been sort of trying to trace through looking at some of the English and Hindi textbooks in particular that are used in secondary school involves people in doing things like writing a letter to the local district magistrate complaining about the state of the drains in the neighbourhood. Now, Rajesh seemed to have thoroughly absorbed this notion, this practice of citizenship. And these notions of citizenship were in turn linked in Rajesh's mind to the idea of serving the village and serving Nandakini Valley more broadly. This relates in part to traditions of labour sharing within agriculture, which placed a premium on maintaining good relations within the village. His attachment to the village and the valley, though, I think, which are much more widely shared in Bentley, I think will also relate to its relative isolation geographically. Now, Rajesh's interest in politics was highly selective. He was largely unconcerned about the activities of the Uttarakhand government, political parties, local politicians. Nor was Rajesh interested in local and district politics particularly. He said he'd never become the leader, the pradhan of the local village council or panchayat. Rather, Rajesh expressed his dual sense of national citizenship and village belonging through engaging in everyday activities that were political in the sense of being about generating consensus and navigating conflict in the pursuit of a definite end, with the additional rider that these activities were political because they bore on questions of compromise, hierarchy, power and state authority. So, Rajesh assisted local people during periods of medical emergency, often by negotiating with government doctors and those in the village running jeeps to and from a local town. He also helped to coordinate responses to specific problems in the village. For example, on one occasion he found a solution to a problem of water supply. He liaised with the government officer responsible for water supply and lots of local people. He fixed up the drainage, the water pipe system above the village to make sure that everyone got a decent supply. Rajesh also campaigned to get facilities in the local school, like the bicycles. Especially important, though, in Rajesh's local politics was his efforts to intervene within interpersonal disputes when conflict threatened to erupt in one of Bentley's households. He was like grandpa in this respect. I'll just tell one more quick story that illustrates this. A young man named Shiv Singh, this is different from the shopkeeper story, but it's also about an affair, I'm afraid. A young man named Shiv Singh from Bentley had been having an affair with a young woman who lived in Delhi, called Meena. Shiv Singh had been working in Delhi. Shiv had told Meena that they would get married, neglecting to mention he was already married and he already had 3 children in Bentley. Quite unexpectedly, and you'd have to live in Bentley to realise just how weird this was. One day, Meena decided, in June this year, to make the 2-day journey from Delhi on her own to visit her sweetheart. Bursting in on Shiv and his wife, I won't say how flagrante, I don't know the details. He burst in on Shiv and his wife in their Bentley home. Shiv's immediate response, interestingly, was to call upon Rajesh and 3 other friends from the village to come and help minimise the scandal. Rajesh helped to calm down Shiv's quite elderly parents and also prevent the police from interfering in the dispute. And these activities involved him in a constant, incessant round of negotiations. His mobile phone, 2 mobile phones, did not stop ringing for 48 hours. He missed a night's sleep. He was constantly engaged in trying to sort out these problems. He said at the end of this exhaustive 48 hours to me, "I have no space left in my heart for sheep sing." But he was equally adamant that it was his duty, as Faz, to protect the reputation of the village and its smooth functioning as a social unit, and Rajesh emphasised his sacrifice. Now, this brief portrait of Rajesh points to the difficulties, first of all, faced by young people, especially young men in this case, growing up in Bentley. And it also says, I think, some interesting things about their politics. Government education is in a dire state, and many young people face long-term unemployment or underemployment. There is, to recall the work I did in Western UP, a certain amount of time pass going on in this area. Boredom, demoralisation, and fear are big problems in the village. There's actually another paper I'm writing at the moment on low-level spirit possession among young men. I think we'll sort of possibly think about doing that as an alternative topic, but some of the young men who are unemployed are talking about becoming possessed by ghosts. Not in a dramatic way, but over a sort of low level for several years at a time, and that's affecting their behaviour. And they're also very, very fearful of ghosts. So we've heard lots of stories about young men in this position of unemployment seeing, a fox with a human head at night. Bad spirits and ghost possession is quite an aspect of this sort of social crisis. Now, some young people migrate to the cities, and if you manage to get work there successfully, but the majority who migrated, like Rajesh, had to come back because of the illness of the family, or because they were married locally and had to look after their families. Our overall impression, in spite of what I just said about demoralisation and time pass, was actually, though, of the busyness of rural youth, their energy. Young men commonly engage in various agricultural tasks, they run small businesses, they travel to tourist spots for work, and they conduct manual wage labour in the government or privately. Especially significant were new opportunities for young people to collect caterpillar fungus, which is called kirajali, which is sold to local traders. The thin black fungi are about an inch long, and they can be found extending out of a mummified caterpillar. And I can talk for hours until late into the night about kirajali. Apparently the Chinese consider the caterpillar to be an aphrodisiac. It's also been associated with enhanced performance for athletes. The kirajali are found at about 15,000 feet, 1 day's, or actually 2 days, long and strenuous hike from Bentley. I'm not boasting I did do it in a day, it's actually more sensibly a 2-day hike from Bentley up to about 15,000 to 16,000 feet. This shows us on the way to the area where they collect the kirajali. This is Rajesh actually looking for them. He's not going to find them there because they tend to only be where we're way above the tree line here. It tends to be particularly where the snow's melting there. Rajesh's case also draws attention to what I thought was what we thought was really quite remarkable about the practices of these educated and employed young people. That's the amount of time they put into social and political work. Young people have a strong sense that they should work with the state in order to improve the village. And to a greater extent than either uneducated young people or educated youth who migrated outside the village, educated unemployed young people in Bentley had the time, the motivation and skills, especially literacy, to help local people. They were imbued too with this notion of citizenship and service. Now the example of Kirpal, I want to go on to next, brings out this point even more strongly. Kirpal was 28 in March 2012. He was a GC man from a poor household in Bentley. He was 10th class pass. He married at the age of 21. He left work in Mumbai, where he manned the Speak Your Weight machine in a shopping mall. Other jobs followed, but he returned to Bentley in 2007 when his first son was born. He now has 2 sons and a daughter. Kirpal was a lively commentator on local corruption. He said that school teachers are burdened with too many duties and they can no longer teach. He said the government's midday meal scheme in schools doesn't work. He said that the system of awarding contracts to build government buildings is mired in corruption and personal favouritism. He also said that the village council head gives the position of labour contractor on government projects to his own cronies, all points we were able to verify through our own research. Kirpal claimed that politics in the sense of Rajniti, by which he meant big P politics, was not the answer to these problems. But Kirpal is an eager participant in public meetings at the local village council, at parent-teacher meetings at school. He said that he had no qualms about raising his voice in these venues. Kirpal used his mobile phone to photograph examples of corruption, such as badly constructed village paths or bridges, and he used these photographs in meetings. Now, there were a few educated unemployed young men who capitalised on their charisma through taking on responsibility for construction projects and setting themselves up as contractors. Kirpal was fiercely critical of these young men who he termed thieves. He said they were ruining the reputation of youth and that the true path lay in trying to help the village and valley rather than lining one's own pockets. Kirpal also acted as a motivator, persuading villagers to invest in government microcredit schemes, explaining to them ways of managing the forests sustainably, and negotiating with government officials. Kirpal had helped SCs to obtain government training. He also had a keen sense of environmental problems affecting the village, and he sometimes patrolled the forest to check for thieves. Kirpal was also frequently involved in local protests. There was a wonderful one that happened in 2005 that involved villagers going to an area of jungle quite close to Bentley and actually themselves, having borrowed tools from the local town, constructing a road. They only managed to have 100 metres. It wasn't much more than a sort of trekking path, but it served to embarrass the administration into action. Villagers construct their own roads, a great headline in the newspapers. The story travelled as far as Delhi. He also protested about things like the communications tower, about issues like number of teachers in local schools around electricity. Kirpal said that as a young person he has the capacity to change things. He said the new generation have new ideas, new projects and new energy. He said between the ages of 18 and 30 you have the chance to alter what is happening. So he was self-consciously imagining himself as part of a generation changing things. Now, his example is important, I think, because it points to the very significant role that young people play in negotiating with officials over resources. There was another young man who was even more involved than Kirpal in these activities. His name was Jaipal. He'd actually won election to the area council. He was rare in the village in this respect, having actually successfully contested a local election. But Jaipal's chief interest, like that of Kirpal, was trying to enhance villagers' access to social goods. Jaipal was especially important in bringing electricity to the village in 2007 and increasing the numbers of teachers in local schools. He told us about how he led government electricity officials around the surrounding jungle, pointing to where high-tension wires and low-tension wires should go. So I led him through the jungle. The grass was that high. He remembered this. He had built up good relationships with various electricity officials. Now, Kirpal's and Jaipal's example also hints, I think, at the inclusive nature of March GC politics. SC said that GC youth's efforts to improve the electricity supply, water provision, schooling and communications technology in Bentley were, to a large extent, to everyone's benefit. This probably reflects the relatively egalitarian nature of the village, and a sense of local community that's grown up in the context of Bentley's isolation. Now, if caste was not a major divide, gender was very important. There were gender variations in the capacity of young people to engage in local politicking, with educated young women in the village excluded from opportunities to effect change in public arenas. For most young women, generative politics remained at the level of very small-scale acts of boldness. This point can be developed through consideration of a final young person, Leela, who was 28 and had a BA and B.Ed in 2012. She's currently actually living in Peshawar, in the district town, doing an MA in economics. While then, she also looks after her two nephews, helping them get tuition and ensuring that they move up smoothly through school. Leela found it impossible to acquire a teaching position because of a lack of opportunities. She said that as a woman she couldn't enter business. The only forms of paid employment that she said she could do locally, private teaching and NGO work, have little scope. Leela's recently become engaged to a young man who has a BA in small business in the nearby village. Her choice of marriage partner was highly constrained because young men were concerned about marrying someone of that age. She was considered to some extent overage, and also concerned about her being so educated. One of her suitors came and said that she's two tears, which is a double-edged word, meaning both kind of bold but also headstrong. Leda said that she suffers from a great deal of tension, using the English word, as a result of her marriage situation, compounded by her unemployment. Now, Leda's not very interested in politics, in the sense of party politics, but to a greater extent than uneducated young women, she participated in several political protests, for example, in relation to schooling. She also had a sense of being educated, of being paralympic, and this has given her a general sense of being able to cope with social hardships in public life. Leda referred, for example, to an instance in which a man was speaking rudely to young women in a local city. The women, including Leda, had come to do a government employment exam. Leda upbraided the man for his rude assumption that rural young women would be dull and ignorant. She also arranged for the young women in the exam to sit together in a particular section of the exam hall so they could concentrate. Leda said, "I showed him that I was someone who could speak, and I'm not afraid of raising my voice." And Leda told me this story over and over again as an example of her public confidence. This brief portrait of Leda is again more broadly indicative. There were some opportunities for young women to obtain paid work in and around Bentley. A few had got into high schools in temporary positions, and some were involved in government nurseries, but the majority found it very difficult to acquire salaried work. They also found it very difficult to obtain paid work while waiting for a government job to materialise. And these uncertainties over marriage exacerbated young women's insecurity still further. Young women were not as involved in politics as men, but educated young women often spoke of themselves as people with the awareness and sense of self-reliance required to act politically when required to do so. They said especially they had the capacity to adjust, using the English word, different situations, and that education had given them that capacity to adjust. And this sense of latent political potential is itself, I think, highly important and generative of various forms of politicking within the family and more broadly, particularly if we include things like getting medical assistance for an ill relative as a form of politics, which I can tell you it is in this part of India. So I want to conclude by restating my argument briefly and anticipating some possible objections before questions. Youth in Bentley, as should be clear, faced a wide range of frustrations. The poor condition of local schools, deterioration in the environment, a shortage of white-collar jobs. Marginalised from mainstream India, they felt actually very bewildered about the changes occurring around them. As such, they stand as powerful examples of what is a global problem of youth insecurity, particularly articulation across the world between age and capitalism, and young women were especially subordinated. But educated young people were not passive. They engaged in a range of forms of paid and unpaid work in the political sphere. They were similarly enterprising. They didn't participate mainly in self-interested, reactionary or violent political activities. To recall Mannheim's idea, youth, where we were working, were a kind of general generational force, incrementally seeking to improve local society through almost a type of capillary action. Their politics was often social, in the double sense that it was about social issues like education and health, and in the sense that it involved building up networks of mutual trust and responsibility. The activities of young people in Bentley occurred in the sphere of direct negotiation between people and state officials that Parker Chatterjee terms political society, which is also central to Bayard's account of the politics of Bentley. It involved persuading a police officer to overlook a fine, negotiating with a government doctor, and so on. But young people's practices in Bentley differed from those of people in political societies conceived by Chatterjee. They went about their daily work in a civilised manner, they were scrupulously legal, and they were non-violent. And yet young people's practices failed to qualify for the title civil society in its Hegelian sense because it wasn't institutionalised, for example, within associations or clubs. So a more generous definition of civil society might be required in this context to allow for deliberative, inclusive, civil and progressive political actions that nevertheless take place outside formal organisations.
The participants within this non-institutionalised civil society are not centrally concerned at the local level with trying to get a share of resources, even if some youth have become contractors on development projects. More often, their politics was attuned to problem solving, building public relationships with sympathetic government officials, and through this means actually creating resources, both in their own self-interest and the interest of the village. These forms of generative politics did not amount to anything as grand as a movement. I'm not claiming that. They flickered into life at particular moments, for example, when a pipe dried up or when someone needed medical care. But this shouldn't detract from the overall point that the actions of young people in Bemney really do not align at all well with contradictions of youth politics and unemployed youth politics you see in publications like that of the World Bank. Interesting question here then might be, what do youth want from the state? Young people in Bemney imagined the state, Sarkar, as a source of employment. They believed in the nation-state idea. They wanted to serve India. They believed in political institutions in New Delhi, and that they're just and that they're important. This reflects, I think, the durability of notions of liberal democracy and rights in the minds of the young, even in the context that they're experiencing the ineptitude, the corruption of the state in its local incarnations in the local area. I want to end by anticipating three possible objections to our argument about generative politics. I hope I'm not stealing your thunder here in anticipating these objections, but I want to identify three. I'm imagining Partha Chatterjee's in the room. What he might say is, he might say, well, what we're describing as generative politics is in truth only political society, allocative politics, viewed from the point of view of the winners, in this case GC-educated youth in a particular village. And it's true that politics we've described does work through established patron-client networks. It involves young people cultivating links with higher-ups within the state administration. But what I've tried to stress is that many of the benefits that GC young people obtain are shared by the uneducated, by SCs, and by people in nearby villages. The generative politics is only allocative in the minimal sense that it takes some money out of the pockets of the contractors and district level officials and those even at higher levels. The second objection that Partha Chatterjee might make is that the politics we're describing is really rather specific to remote areas of the high Himalayas. And this is a slightly trickier argument to gainsay, for the obvious reason that we lack contemporary knowledge of local politics in large numbers of villages spread across North India, which is a great shame. And it's good to hear today about people who are actually rectifying that problem in urban and rural areas. But my previous work in Western UP, where politics is less obviously generative at the local level, does allow me to say something about what might be distinctive and generalisable about Bemney. What is probably distinctive, viewed from the perspective of North India more widely, is that caste in Bemney is not heavily politicised, and therefore GCs and SCs work together on development projects and bargaining with the state to a greater extent than they do, for example, in most villages in Western UP. What is also slightly distinctive is the manner in which people identify socially and culturally with the village and valley. But what is not distinctive, and therefore where I think we can generalise and think more broadly, is that an educated young generation have emerged steeped in notions of universal citizenship. So one of the key questions I'd like to come to with anyone who's interested in youth and broader questions, what happens when you have a set of people who are very much well versed in notions of universal citizenship and rights, and at the same time are finding that their economic security is crumbling? The third objection that might be made, the final objection, is that the generative politics that we're describing is really not very effective. Educated youth remain in a rather precarious position, and the village remains poor relative to surrounding areas, to say nothing of the big cities. Moreover, scholars such as Partha Chatterjee might point out that the generative politics is rather convenient for the state and for the powerful who are not being pressured into redistributive measures. They can simply sit back and let energetic youth play around the edges of the state, getting resources where they can. Generative politics may, in this optic, simply be the socio-political equivalent to collecting those caterpillar fungi, short-term and not really a viable life strategy. But this final argument underestimates the extent to which young people may, through engaging in generative politics, develop new ways to press the state into action. Unusual partnerships, unusual conversations are going on at the local level. Think of that young man leading the electricity officials around the jungle. What this analysis suggests, I think, from a policy perspective, is the existence of a durable core of trust and goodwill in the hearts and minds of a new generation that could be tapped as a basis for encouraging more durable, more joined up, and long-term forms of generative politics. So that's it. I welcome any questions, objections, comments.
I'm sure you'll get plenty of all of that. Would you like to come and sit? Would you happy to stand?
I actually might prefer to stand, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I thank you for that very thought-provoking paper. I have several inchoate thoughts in response, and somewhere I'm struggling to actually understand how do you conceptualize the category youth? So what is the normative force of that category that you posit that youth ought to be doing? Because there is a giveaway quote from one of your from one of the people you mentioned today. And he says, between 18 and 31, you can change. That's, I think, your second person. And it's if you look at, if you look at actually other sources of understanding what that age of life is, it's not necessarily youth for them, because youth has, if you think of it as Kishoravastha, which is actually prior to being a householder, is the time of youth where you're actually experimenting, learning, apprenticeship, what we here might understand by youth, whereas 18 to 31 is actually the time of the householder. And these people are householders despite, so employment really doesn't have a bearing on you becoming a proper person in that sense of, So I was trying to understand what the normative force of youth as a category for you is in terms of politics, in terms of how they situate themselves vis-a-vis the world which they want to change. So as youth, as householders, as political subjects. So, and I think a similar sort of question I had was about education. So apart from producing national subjects, which it does, I guess that's what, in many ways, is one way of looking at what education does. So what is the purchase of education in this story? What is, being educated really, what is for you the purchase on education, or, on your story? I'll start with that and then I guess pass on.
They're very interesting questions, and allows me to talk about something I didn't have time to talk about in the presentation, which is sort of local conceptions of what constitutes youth. What's been very interesting and has happened very quickly in this area is the creation of a category of Jawan, of youthhood among young people, particularly among young women, but also among young men. 30 years ago, young women were getting married at the age of, even 20 years ago, they were getting married at the age of 13 or 14. Now they're getting married in their early to mid-20s. That relates to a large extent to much longer education. It creates this period which their mothers and their grandmothers didn't have of youthhood. And a whole range of questions of what does one do in that situation of youth? And I think the older generation are very concerned about it. The obvious reason, how does one sort of control the sort of young bodies of women who are not with husbands or in their married home, they're still sort of around the village, maybe going to the local town to get qualifications. And actually James written a paper in a couple of papers, one in American Ethnologist and one in the American Association of American Geographers, both of them look at this question from the point of view of teenage girls, a bit younger than the section that I'm interested in here. But I think sort of delayed marriage, an extension of the time in which both women and men search for jobs, has created this sense that there is a period where one isn't fully integrated into society, in the sense that of actually not being sort of you're not married, you haven't got children, you do have this potential to
to engage in the kind of social and political work that I described. Now, the question of the normative where that becomes a normative category is interesting. I haven't thought a great deal about that, except maybe in the context of thinking that one of the ways in which organisations like the World Bank and the Indian government, and this filters through the textbooks as well, I think, construct youth is not just, of course, just as a danger, but also as the potential, which must filter down to the village level. I mean, the youth are the problem, and they're the panacea, they're the heroes and the villains, they're the angels and the devils. And in the sense I'm trying to get away from, we're trying to get away from that kind of language. So some of that may filter down, and that may partly explain why people like I was saying, this is our moment, this is, we should do it. So that's youth. In terms of the purchase of education, it is a curious situation here. I've written much more about this in the context of Western UP, in the cultural production of the educated person in the book Degrees Without Freedom, about the meanings that people invest in education. And education makes you, it's not just about getting qualification, it makes you confident, it makes you human, it separates you from illiterates who are then imagined in very negative terms. So education is deep to the social and cultural meanings. We found less of that here, actually. And education was tended to be thought of more in instrumental terms. But there was an element of that sense, particularly among young women, as I recounted Lilo. Education allows you to stand on your own 2 feet. It allows you to be bold and confident. It allows you to go into a government office or go to a government doctor and say, I can see on this medicine bottle that it says twice a day. Why did you tell my mother once a day? It gives you a certain kind of capacity to move, to become amphibious, to move between the rural and the urban, and to become a proper citizen. So there is that sense of education. There's also, I argue this in Western UP, if education gives you anything, it gives you the ability to critique the system that's produced you. So there's a lot of people saying, yeah, I know this BEd I'm doing is completely useless. I know this Masters I'm doing in English is completely useless. But what else can I do? So there's a sense of, a really sad sense of actually, Rajesh isn't a fool. He knows that actually, reading for this Masters in English literature is not going to really get him anywhere. But he persists because, you have, at some level, you continue to hope.
Adam.
Hi. Following on from youth as a category, I was wondering whether you have done or intend to follow the transition out of this period of youth. Because one of the things that strikes me is there when your guy is saying 18 to 30 this is our time, this is a possibility, does that become reified in a sense that when you leave that category, then you have responsibilities of another kind, and it also almost becomes that the job of the youth of the village is dispute mediation and is working with local politics.
That's very interesting. I had a graduate student, Romani, who's looking at youth who age out with youth NGOs in Calcutta, and what happens to them when they're no longer eligible. And it ties in also with a chapter. I read a book called co-edited with Dyson called Telling Young Lives, which is the stories, portraits of young people in different parts of the world. One of the first ones, and I think one of the best ones in the book, is by someone called Christy Gibson. It's about a young man, a homeless young man in New York, and his aging out of the homeless shelters, and what happens, and all the vulnerabilities that then become associated with no longer being a youth trying to find a shelter in New York. It's a totally new ball game for him. So that's a slightly left field response to your question, but it made me think of those things. And I think that you're raising a really important point here now about the burdens that might be placed upon young people in a situation where they become the sort of stylized as the energetic agents of change in the village. And I suppose in terms of kind of looking around the corner at what might happen if this idea of generative politics became sort of generalised, I'm not particularly concerned about that, because I think that there is, as I said in the last sentence, this sort of real energy and sense among many young people that do my work. They want want to be much more involved in the governance of the village, and that the routes, the existing routes through which they might do that, like joining the challenge or trying to get a government job, are blocked. So there is that sort of potential. I suppose at the same time, one would make, it's quickly to make the point that actually a lot of these activities are activities that should probably be the responsibility of the state and not of ordinary citizens. And there's a real need for the state to actually partner and assume responsibility for a lot of these basic functions. I think in the absence of that, though, there's a sort of ghost infrastructure idea of things like aerial youth centres and even the employment guarantee scheme is supposed to be a youth scheme to some extent, but it's not being fulfilled. So the infrastructural system's there, but it needs to be activated and it needs to be sort of joined up. That's, I think, kind of a crucial development issue at the moment. Down the line, well, I'm not saying it's an objection, but a possible objection comes into play.
And I suppose also, as is true of young people all over the world, people become disillusioned. So we can't necessarily assume that this faith in the state or wanting to be involved in bringing services, etc., will endure, given how many knocks are going to come up against post-30.
I think you're quite right. I think one reason why there is this enthusiasm is the state has done a lot in the last 7 or 8 years. It's built the road. It's built a cricket ground. It's really improved the roads. There's a communications tower, mobile reception. So I said it's like a specific conjunction, which raises these very interesting questions, I think, about the potential for partnerships between young people and the state.
Nishant.
Two questions. One is about, I was wondering if you inquired a little more about the variables of these three people. For example, why are they so acceptable in that structure of village? They may be very serious. For example, someone of their family may have such various equality or that at village level might have those qualities to unite people that came as a lineage, passed down, the acceptance or legitimacy was passed down through that, or particularly I'm interested to know about the caste factor, because my experiences, I've been to some of the fields in Bihar, and the local governance, to the state local governance, but I found there was often the caste structure had a lot to do with the question of acceptability. For example, if a particular youth or whatever it is belongs to a particular caste or higher caste in particular, he'll have more acceptability among the villagers because of that dominant hegemonic structure, rather than if a Dalit, even if he becomes a pradhan or a mukhya in the panchayat, a leader in the panchayat, he will not have that kind of acceptability. So the question of acceptability was very important. And secondly, the question of genetic politics. Why do you think genetic politics becomes so important? Is it because of the lack of a scope or opportunity for formal politics in the area? Why this question is important is because with the local governance model, the Panchayati Raj model, getting deep into the villages, and because of these schemes like Narela and the Panchayats heading these schemes, if these youth are so acceptable, if they have so much legitimacy in the village, why don't they enter through the formal politics way of doing things, which gives them more opportunity to serve people in a more formal way? And how do you think this generative politics has this merit over this organized formal logic of politics?
Well, to go into the question, I'll answer them quite briefly, and maybe come back to them to let lots of people ask questions if you want. I think one sort of common thread that runs through the research I've been doing in India since 1995 is an interest in sort of key moments of change, either at the level of the individual or at the level of the nation, and the sort of opportunities that those key moments of change provide for sometimes counterintuitive political formations. I accept your point, absolutely, the caste is really very important in terms of thinking about local political opportunities. Don't dispute that, and SCs are not nearly as able to develop the kind of leadership profiles that Rajesh and Rupal were able to generate. But in this particular moment, they are coming together to campaign for school classrooms, to campaign for communications tower. They're coming together in lots of different ways. And so I think that it's counterintuitive, but I think it's very interesting. And I've got a paper at the moment that's just talking about an economy and society. It's online called Waiting for Change, which is a development of argument and time. And that looks at the parallel kind of situation in which you've also got sort of counterintuitive cross-caste mobilisation. In that case, it's like caste hanging out in a young people hanging out in a university and suddenly sort of forming alliances across caste lines, which actually has since broken down with the success of the BSP, and I tell the story in that paper. So I think, I suppose a broader thing I'd sort of take out of your question is it's very interesting to think about your counterintuitive moments in politics in contemporary India. The second question is very interesting, and I think I'd be interested to hear people comment on this. It seems to me that one could develop a very interesting comparative project at the moment in India and also across the world on anti-political politics, by which I mean forms of politics that take formal politics not just as something they don't do, but as a negative point of reference. So these guys like Rajesh are actually saying, I'm going to do everything that politicians don't do. I'm going to be accountable to the people I help. I'm not going to line my own pockets. I'm not going to do things in an illegal way. And so political society in Chatterjee's terms, because actually in a way they're not operating. And the big politician is actually the person that they're not going to be. And the reason why, the reason why this politics is criminalised. It's highly, it's become increasingly criminalised into the kind of UP since the 1960s. And also, in terms of risk of the war, there's very little chance of becoming an MLA. If you were a villager, you might be able to build up a profile as a sort of local contractor and all like that. But that's not. Becoming an MLA is not really an option. So actually, even if you're sort of thinking about self-interested politics again, it's not really the way to go.
But if you look into the local politics, particularly in the villages, so if you start looking from a different angle, these MLAs or the big leaders, firstly, I doubt whether the aversion is really towards politics as such, or is it towards the particular behavior of politicians. Secondly, the question is, if you look at it from the other angle, the MLAs generally try to locate these people who can perform these kind of jugaads, or the way they legitimize themselves among the public. They look for these people to gain legitimacy or use them as trump cards during election times, because these MLAs can't reach to these common people. So it also goes the other way around.
Well, and I said some of these people are, the contractors are connected to local MLAs. Some of the people are being absorbed in that way. And that's the story that comes out quite a lot. But there is also this sort of zone of everyday politics. People helping their families get medical help, people kind of negotiating, building up things with government officials, which tends to fall out of the picture. Because I think it tends to really sort of come out of sort of spending a very long time living with people locally, hearing about these kind of everyday problems. So let's speak the importance of that story. But in terms of the first part of what you just said about is it politics or is it politicians, I think it's both. I think people are averse to a large duty. I think it's, where we're working, they don't want to think about politics. And so the social has become the terrain of the political. So you talk about yourself as a social reformer, as a social activist, not a politician, which creates a problem for anthropologists, because then you're placing upon people's actions a category that isn't consistent with how they themselves describe their actions. Calling it generative politics when they're talking about it's social action. I think it's good intellectual reasons for doing that. But I think that there is this general disillusionment with Rajniti, politics, or politics in English, as a mode of life, even to the extent of not voting. They've been highly active in these kind of things, not even voting.
There's a couple of questions. Asim, Louise. First, Asim. And I just want to say that these are I don't know. They're not social reformers at all. They're highly interested in protecting reputations and actually very conservative. They don't want change. So they don't want women to go away when they're angry with their husbands. They want to bring them back. So it isn't emancipatory politics that they're pursuing. So development pursuits are not politics, I would say. But
can I just answer that? Because you said, they're partial penetrations, aren't they? In Paul Willis's rather unfortunate term, he's got belly to Labour. Just like all politics, it's contradictory, it's shot through with contradictions. So I could talk with lots of examples of ways in which it's not conservative, and you could then come up with other ways in which it's conservative. Just like the politics of David Cameron or Ed Miliband or anything, it's ordinary politics. That's part of the point in time past, that you've got people who are coming out in the streets and say, I'm against corruption, and in the evening they're doing deals with the principals of the colleges to make money. And they say, when I say, oh, hold on, that really interrupts my whole idea of subaltern politics. I say, hold on, Craig, that's ordinary politics. Where's your pension? Where's your pension fund? Well, yes, actually, the pension's connected to these shady deals. So I accept the point. In some ways, it's conservative. It's partial penetration. That's the point I raised in the Economy and Society paper as well. Actually, a lot of these forms of counterintuitive politics end up being very gendered. So the gender argument, I think, is really important. But nevertheless, in some ways, they're quite innovative.
Yes, but not personally.
Okay, so I just want to begin with a small comment, which I just want you to think more about. My questions are different. It's about World Bank, actually, which has come out with this new agenda for the kind of the roadmap ahead. And if you want to sum it up, it's jobs, jobs, jobs. In fact, there's an Indian economist who's now heading the World Bank, Kaushik Basu, who was the economic advisor to the Prime Minister for the last few years. He came out with this small post online where he said, my only agenda is to create jobs the world over. And I think World Bank is, what you presume it is thinking about youth might have undergone a bit of a transformative, rethinking happening there. Some top people actually moved out and some new thinkers coming in to lead it. Well, my question is more about your approach to research, the nature of your social inquiry, to put it very broadly. Primarily, to begin with, at some point you did give a certain rationale why you thought this was an interesting topic. You cited very passingly the Arab Spring, and to some extent how it does not quite relate to the Indian scenario. I would like you to talk a bit more about what you actually think the Arab Spring was. Was it the category of youth? Is it really, in your perception, the driving reason for those changes happening there? And a little bit of clarity on why you presume this research has this relevance. So I'm just interested in why you're pursuing this. And secondly, in a more, more critically, why is this research coming from someone who's done work in Western UP and continuing to pursue the youth as an object of inquiry? So primarily my interest is that is there something happening in the way we think about Indian politics? Maybe it's the Rahul factor, as it's called in the press, the emergence of younger leaders, but again in associations with their they're not exactly young, they might be young by age, but they're not what you call youth leaders in the sense they've not emerged out of student life like in the 60s, you have a whole generation of leaders coming from college. In fact, the role of Lingdo committee, and my final sort of point that you might want to reflect more on is your constant reference to civil society as the reference point. And I'm just amazed at the lack of evidence you've actually given us to prove that the engagement in political, real mainstream politics has actually fallen. So again, your kind of social research where you look at small village and then generalize on how do you think your evidence matches up to those conclusions? Thank you.
No.
If it's, okay, I think there's lots of questions here, and to some extent sort of comments. Let me take maybe the second thing you asked and the last thing you asked, which seemed to me to be the sort of the most maybe important in terms of the kind of conceptual framing for what I said. And I think I'm not an expert on the Arab Spring, I don't claim to be. But I think there's some very interesting
possibilities for thinking about surprising connections and unexpected differences between, say, what happened in Egypt in January 2011 and in contemporary India. So here's a surprising similarity. People who know more about this can sort of help me to think along these lines. And the surprising similarity is that a lot of the critiques of the state in both places, maybe this isn't surprising, but an interesting resonance is that the critiques of the state are pretty similar. They're about corruption, they're about a lack of jobs for educated graduates, and that was the same too in Tunisia. There's interesting parallels in terms of the use of technology. I talked about using the mobile phone to take pictures, but also putting the mobile phone on speakerphone and developing a relationship with government officials. It's quite public, and people can see and hear that you're not.
I'm really sorry to interrupt, but we have the room booked for 6:15.
We have it until 7.
You have it until 7?
Yes, it's every Wednesday until 7.
We weren't told that people waiting outside.
Will you give us 10 more minutes, please?
Sorry?
Could you give us 10 more minutes? We're just winding this up and then take some last questions. Thanks.
The phone on speakerphone, and people notice that you're not actually doing a deal with a police officer, you're actually trying to solve a public problem. So there's interesting, I think, links with technology. In this case, mobile phones. In the case of the Arab Springs, of social media and mobile phones. One of the key differences there, I think, is that and I made sort of at the beginning of developing conversations around this with people. It seems to me that one of the interesting things about India is what I said at the beginning, about there hasn't been that kind of large-scale youth mobilisation against the state in India.
Maoism?
Maoism, I mean, well, it's interesting because most of the Naxalites are under 26, but it's not that kind of coordinated democratic movement that you've seen in the Arab Spring. Mm-hmm. So I think it is the Jai Prakash Narayan movement is a closer parallel to North Africa than the Middle East, I think. I mean, actually, the Maoism is very interesting, and so of course is the Hindu right and Hansen and Hussein. Who have been successful at mobilising youth in post-colonial India? The far right and the far left. Meanwhile, the Nehru youth centres are empty. So I think that's an interesting sort of question to think about. The point about non-engagement with formal politics was not central to the argument I was making today. I was actually interested in the character of people's everyday politics. In response to the question, I made the note that actually there is this critique of formal politics going on. So I don't think my paper, I'm being very defensive here. I think you provided no evidence, be very defensive. My paper doesn't stand or fall on the evidence I can provide of people's non-engagement with formal politics. It will take a certain kind of different methodology to really, but it is something that comes very strongly out of the research I've done in Western UP, and it is also very evident at Uttarakhand. There is this general dissatisfaction with the state, and this sense of doing extra political politics or even anti-political politics. And I think that could be the beginning of an interesting conversation, and it's an interesting way to link up different people's projects as well. Think about anti-political politics.
We have very little time, sorry. We can take it
just one point on the youth wings of political parties. Youth wings in every political party. That's you may want to.
Yeah, but if you look at Time Plus, they're not active they weren't active in Meerut in the 2000s. So you had these youth wings and you had the student wings.
Yeah.
But the parties were very distanced, actually. I mean, it was more like they were connected to the contractors linking out to the MLAs, as you said. But again, this relates to the far left and far right being effective in mobilising youth. Yes, things have changed a bit. I know with Rahul, with Yadav and things, but it's not as developed as you might imagine.
Louise.
Two questions which are slightly discrete and more or less forward. The first, I suppose, just to continue where we are now, interested to continue on this comparison between formal and anti-politics. If I look at the statistics on turnout among young people, turnout among the Indian youth was pretty similar to all other age groups. So there isn't a great disaffection in terms of electoral participation among the anecdotally, in the course of my research, I've come across many young people who actually engage with party politics for quite similar reasons to the people that you described today. So I wonder whether if you were to research, not necessarily people who are engaged in the youth of local political parties, but engaged in formal politics, you may also come across more generative forms of politics than these critics who are standing outside of the party system suggest. One, I think, in some senses, has to push back against the assumption that all party politics are corrupt and organised. There are still people engaged in party politics for what we might consider virtuous reasons. So that's kind of one question, observation, comment. The other is to ask you more specifically about the drug hunt as a context for the kind of politics you describe it. And my interest in this is partly, I'm not interested in state creation, and I'm interested in how political engagement takes place after the drug hunt into the state. And one of the interesting things that happens in the drug hunt, unlike other new states, which is very drug engaged at the same time, is you have a very striking increase in the number of assembly constituencies. The drug hunt goes from having 19 constituencies when it was part of UP to having 70 today. And that has produced, I think, and again, this is more of an uninformed observation, but I think it produced a much more localised form of politics. And you see that in the indecisive election results we've seen in state assembly elections just this year, last year. And I wonder whether some of the views that your characters here are describing actually don't sound that different to the way in which party politics is operating in Vietnam too, which is that it's increasingly localised. There's fairly weak party loyalty, more loyalty to individuals than to parties, and probably a lot of emphasis on very local issues rather than big questions of state and policy. So it's another question that crosses the boundary between these realms of politics, but particularly interested in the drug hunt context.
The first observation, I completely agree with you that generative politics can happen through people joining a political party. And it's true for just in the West, and Gordon showed that very clearly. And that would be a plain as we expected to happen. You've got this kind of connections. Of course, now I'm not skewed because I've worked with a delegate to a party that hasn't had delegates very much in Western UP. And Hugo Gorges working down there makes the same point about the disconnect between a party with apparently agendas and actually what's happening on the ground. So I said, well, I need to check against that. We were quite right to push me on it. I think that's an important point. I also take the second part, main observation. It's not one I feel, maybe something I'll answer better in 3 years' time when we've spent longer there and moved up in scale. So done some research more in the block, town, and district to look at some of these connections. I think it's very interesting what you're saying about that. I've also noticed that political parties, like the young people I'm describing, have become quite reactive rather than proactive in the kind of ways in which they engage in politics. So the atrocity, for example, in Western UP, or the case of the road, in the case with the car, becomes the terrain, the ground on which certain kinds of alliances and certain kind of projects are built, rather than what do we want for education over the next 10, 15 years. And the point about the geography of this and the creation of increasing constituencies, I suppose the other thing I might have to plug into that is the increasing opportunities that potentially creates for various forms of rent seeding at different levels of state. The more constituencies to create, presumably the more resources there are there to tap. And look at that kind of that system. Those are really important and interesting points to sort of take forward as we continue this research.
Last question. Okay, very quick because we're going to be booted out in 2 minutes. So a quick question and then maybe a quick response.
Yes, one of the reasons why Uttarakhand was carved out was because of the daily Kumaoni demand being marginalized from development was not reaching really areas of Uttar Pradesh. So I was wondering, have you looked in your study? Have you looked at and whether the youth in that particular village are disillusioned because the formation of Uttarakhand has not really given them what they were expecting with the carving out of the state. You haven't really talked about, you've talked about daily confrontation with everyday state, with a government official, or not with, with questions of development, yes, as a whole from the Indian state.
Just very, very quickly, they feel like that geographical division of the 1980s and 1990s is now being replayed within Uttarakhand. It's just jumped scale. So, Haldwani and Dehradun, all those areas have all the resources. And, all the things done.
Very quickly, talking about anti-politics, why did then Jayapal join politics? What were his motivations and how did he see politics? Was it different from the others? Was he less cynical or did he have other motivations?
I think he was less cynical. They're never painted in black and white.
No, of course.
There are tendencies here. The tendency is to see reforms of electoral politics. It's not really being particularly useful in the current environment. But some of Jayapal do. They join the child, they become active at sort of slightly higher scales, like the area and the block. But they're in the minority. We're always going to be in the minority, but actually there's not a great deal of competition among young people to hold those positions or to aspire to those positions.
And was he then sort of excluded from the networks of the local pradhans? And it would be harder than I'm assuming if politics is seen as a closed shop with clientelistic networks for someone like him to then effect change around him.
No, he was pretty effective. I mean, in a sense, it's a good argument to make back to someone like Rajesh. But he's he was quite effective in terms of local electoral policies. But there's almost like this visceral, it's almost like, it's like a habitus, something that's at the deepest pit of your stomach. I don't talk about politics. I mean, Rajesh honestly always came from an allergic reaction. And many people were like that. They don't. Rajniti, or Yeti, politics, the English word. And yet, they're incredibly political. And even more so in Mira, the same kind of people don't talk about politics. Whole day wheeling and dealing. It's an interesting phenomenon.
Well, thank you very much for a very thought-provoking paper. Clearly, the number of questions should be just.